welcome everyone to our Alteryx Server webinar series. I believe we can go ahead and get started for today. My name is Gabriel Villela and I will be your host today. For those who don't know me, I am Gabriel Villela. I'm an Alteryx specialist here at Data Meeting. I'm part of the enablement and training team. I'm a data engineer and solutions architect. I am certified in Alteryx Designer, Server, and I also have some partner certifications, and I have been working with Alteryx for over 4 years now. If you want to add me on LinkedIn, do it, right? You're more than welcome to do so. Really quick about Data Meeting. We are a business intelligence consultancy founded in 2005. We provide end-to-end business solutions. We are located in Florida, DC, New Jersey, Chicago, India, and Brazil. We offer creative services, business intelligence services, data management, change management, delivery management, education, and training. And we can also see here pretty important logos for our partners. So we are partnered with AWS, Microsoft Azure, Snowflake, Tableau, for example, right? About our agenda, if you were here from the beginning, it was quite a journey, right? And today it's session number 11, Gallery API Overview. All right. So about the agenda here, really quick, we're gonna see why should we use Gallery APIs, and then some user operations, some admin operations, access that you can leverage on the API. We're gonna get started with the API calls, walking you guys through the documentation on how to build it, and some examples of the authentication methods and how to run apps using APIs, how to migrate workflows using APIs, and how to download workflows. Just examples, right? We're not gonna really get our hands on an Alteryx and build the API call, test it out today. We're just gonna explore the options that are available, right, and see how can I do that. But on the next session, we're actually gonna build an API call, run it, and see it happening live. Okay. All right. So Alteryx Gallery API overview. Why should we use the Gallery API? The first reason is that it is going to enable multi-platform integration with no human interaction. So if you have a system on your company, like a web page or a dashboard or whatever system you have there, right, that is internal to your company, you can integrate that with Alteryx Server. And you can make like a button or something on that system. That button will trigger a series of API calls, and maybe you can trigger a schedule, trigger workflow, and do any kind of sorts of things that you need on the Alteryx server. You can use a web page using the Alteryx engine as the back end, right? So that is pretty cool. You can integrate a web page with Alteryx using the API calls. You can do orchestration and job scheduling with third-party tools. So you can have a third-party application doing orchestration of jobs, right? And you can also migrate workflows between environments. So let's say you have a sandbox environment and also a production environment, right? You test everything on the sandbox first, and then the workflows that are ready to be migrated, they should be moved onto the other Alteryx server environment, the prod. You don't need to do that manually. You can set up API calls to do that. And there's even options within the Gallery UI that will trigger those API calls endpoints to migrate workflows in between environments, all using the API calls, right? So you don't have to do anything manually, just set up the API calls and you're good to go. You can create a BI dashboard to enhance real-time simulation, right? You can have the BI dashboard running some APIs that are triggering the Alteryx server. And of course, you also have the Alteryx server governance, right? So all the API calls, they will follow all the rules of the Alteryx server governance. And all the scheduling that you do using API calls, they are all going to be based and dependent on the gallery, right? So these are some advantages in why you should use the gallery API calls, right? Let's explore now a little bit more of what are the options that we have for APIs. You can see here a table with 3 types, V1, V2, V3. The most recent one, the V3, it is available on server 21.4 or later, the version. And the basic difference here between V1, V2, and V3 is the authorization framework. V1 and V2, they're kind of old, and they only use OAuth 1.0 if you have an older Alteryx version installed. If you have 21.4 or earlier, then you are going to be able to use all the V3 endpoints, and you can also use the OAuth 2.0 on all of them, right? And using the OAuth 2.0, it is much better. The way that you set up the calls, right? It's much easier and more reliable. All right, so now let's explore what are those endpoints and what you can do with the API calls. You're gonna see here a lot of information on all the endpoints for every API call. But this is all on the documentation, right? If you want to take a closer look on any of them, I welcome you to open the documentation and then go check it out, specifically the API call that you're trying to set up. Okay, here I have some endpoints for the V3, and here are all the operations that you can perform around collections. So you can see here you can retrieve all accessible collection records, right? So the first one, they get there. You can create a new collection, so it's the post method, right? You can delete a collection, it's the delete method. You can retrieve a collection record, right? It's the fourth endpoint there. You can update an existing collection to change the name or the owner. You can update collection user permissions. You update collection user group permissions. You can add a new user to a collection, add an insight to a collection, add a schedule to a collection, add a workflow to a collection, add a user group to a collection, and you can also remove a lot of things, right? So you can remove user, remove workflow, insight, scheduler, or user group. So you can see that you can do pretty much everything that you do on the user interface within the gallery. You can do that using API calls, which is really cool, right? Now for credentials, what are the options that we have here for credentials? So we can delete a credential, we can retrieve a credential record, retrieve all credential records. We can share a credential with a user, share a credential with a group. We can remove a user from a credential, and we can remove a user from a credential, a user group from a credential, right? So again, pretty much the same operations that you can perform on the UI. You can do it through the API calls. Now, schedules. You can delete a schedule, you can get information for a specific schedule, update existing schedule, get all schedules, create new schedule, right? So now server connections. Again, right? A lot of operations here that you can do for all the data connections. You can add a user, add a group to a existing data connection. You cannot create a new one here, right? Because you need a lot of information, and it is not quite that user friendly to do that on the API call. So it is not possible to create a new one here. So that's the only thing that is missing here from this list. But you can add the user, you can delete a user, a group, and you can update the name. You can retrieve the connection, right? If you have the connection ID. So pretty much everything here is listed available here for you on the API call. Now, user groups. And again, here is pretty much all the operations that you can perform on the gallery. It is going to be available here for you using the API calls. And the same goes to the user, right? So you can delete a user, retrieve a user, update existing user, retrieve all the users, search for a user, retrieve a full list of assets that a user owns, like all the workflows, right, that a certain user have. Create a new user, deactivate a user, and send an email password reset for a user. Workflows. What can we do with workflows using API calls? We can delete a workflow. We can retrieve a workflow record, update an existing workflow, update all workflow records, update a new workflow, upload a new version of an existing workflow, right? So that is gonna be it here for the v3 endpoints. I'm gonna show you guys now some v1 endpoints. And there are a few endpoints here that they are gonna do the same operation as the v3, but there are a few ones that are only present in the v1. For example, you can publish a YXZP to the system, right? So the post one, the green one that you see, that's specifically to the v1. Or for example, you're gonna retrieve the list of jobs for a particular workflow. You can do that using the v1, right? So let me get my laser pointing here. So this one here, right? Return the last run job and the current state of the workflow. So there are a few operations that you can only do using the v1 endpoints, and these are all the v1 endpoints for admin operations. Okay. Now another v1 endpoint here for jobs and workflows. So you can see here that we can get an output for a given job, right? So this is not possible using the v3, but it is available here on the v1. Retrieve the jobs in its current state. So it is possible using the v1. And using the v1, we can also queue a job for execution, right? So only using the v1 here. All right, so those are like 90% of the endpoints I have presented here. There are a few extra that you can look up on the documentation, and if you need any specific understanding here of any of those endpoints, you're more than welcome to open the documentation page and look on that specific call. So how do we get started, right, with the API calls? How can we see our keys and all the endpoints? So the first thing that you need to make sure is that you have the API access key and secret. In order to see that, you need to go to your profile. So as I'm showing here, go onto your profile in the gallery and then scroll down, and you're gonna see here the area mentioning the API access key and the API access secret. Okay, you're gonna need this to authenticate the API call using the OAuth. So this is where you get this information. Okay, what if you don't see that on your profile? you need to contact the Alteryx Gallery administrator so they can perform this operation now. They will open the admin area of the server, and they are going to locate the user that needs API access. Click on the username, scroll down on the user page here. You're going to see the permissions area, and the API access will be unchecked, right? You just need to click on the edit button up there on the right side of permissions, and then you are going to check that option to enable API access to that particular user. Once you do that, just hit save, and then that user will now be able to see the API key and secret on their profile. By default, all users will not have access to the API. The admin will need to manually enable any of those permissions, including the API access, manually to every user that requires them. Okay? All right, so what about the documentation? How can we see all the endpoints and test those endpoints, right? Now that your user has access to the API, you're gonna see here API documentation link on top, on the top menu, right? So if you hover your mouse over here on this link icon, it is gonna show you this menu here. Just click on API documentation, and then that's gonna open a new page. On this case here, the Swagger page, right? And here you're gonna have a list of all the possible endpoints. I'm showing you guys here the v3 because you see here 3, right, on the URL there, but you can just click on the drop down there to show you the v2 and v1 as well. To expand this, just click on any title there. For example, I'm clicking now on the workflows, and then you're gonna see all the endpoints for workflows. If you click on any of them, then it's gonna expand the area where you can see the example of that request. How can you test this, right? Because there's a test button down below that you can test the API calls here on this page. You need to first authenticate. You're gonna see a red exclamation mark on top right. The first time that you access the page, right? The first time for the session. So you need to click on it, and then it is gonna pop up this window here. You're gonna see OAuth 2.0, right? You're gonna change the type there on that menu to request body. Okay, so open this page here, change the type to request body. Then you're going to insert the client ID and client secret that you have copied from your profile. Okay, so remember, you need to go to your profile to see the API access ID and secret. You're gonna copy that information and paste it in here. Once you do that, click on the authorize button, and you're good to go. You're gonna see now that you no longer have a red exclamation mark, it's blue eye, a blue eye there. That means that this page here has the necessary information to perform the authentication using OAuth 2.0, and you can now test the API call. So if you scroll down a little bit, you're gonna see a try it out button. You can just click on it, and it is gonna request that API call that you are trying. On this case here, I am retrieving all the workflows, right? So you see the request URL. This is the endpoint that I'm using on this example. And this is the response body, right? On this case here, this API, it will return a list of all the workflows in a JSON format, right? So every API call will work with JSON. And one important thing here is that you can see the ID. That ID is the ID of the workflow, ID of the asset that you are working with. In this case, the workflow. And you can really see here this ID on the user area of the gallery. If you open the workflow page and look for that on the URL. So here I'm showing another screenshot here for the user side of the gallery. And if you pay attention, every time that you open the workflow page, you're gonna see a number, a combination of number and letter on the URL, right? That is the same ID that you see here on the API call, right? So if you ever want to find out what is the ID of a certain workflow, you can just simply open that workflow in the gallery and look on the URL, and you're gonna see the ID of that particular workflow. Okay. If you need to open a workflow that you only have the ID, you can copy the ID, change it here on the URL, hit enter, and then it's gonna load that workflow page. Pretty cool. All right, so let's now try it out. Let's try to run here one API call. I'm gonna show you guys a series of images here showing how to test an API call here from this page, right? So I'm selecting here some endpoints for the v1, okay? And I'm gonna run this endpoint here, the app ID questions. So this is gonna get the questions for a given Alteryx Analytic app. So you know that when you have an Alteryx Analytic app, you have some questions that the user needs to answer in order to run that workflow from the gallery, right? This particular endpoint here, it is going to retrieve a list of all the necessary questions for that particular analytic app, okay? So just click on it, and you need to insert the app ID down below. This ID here, right? So this is the workflow ID. You can copy that from the URL, as I mentioned earlier. And after you have authenticated the page, right, you can click on the try it out button, and then that is going to answer with the JSON with all the questions, right? So on this case here, I have one called your name, and it's a text box, and the description is question 1, right? And this is another example where I have more than one question, right? So customer, and then this is a list box, description customer, and then the items that are available for that list box. Customer A, customer B, multiple false because you cannot select multiple, right? So this is the information that you will need to provide if you want to trigger an Alteryx Analytic app using an API call, right? So you will need to provide the answer for each one of those questions if you want to trigger that analytic app using an API call. So that's what we're gonna do next, right? So keep that in mind, those questions. Now we're gonna go back here to the Swagger, the documentation here with all the endpoints. And now I'm gonna click on a different endpoint. The endpoint that will queue a job execution, right? So click on it. This is a post method, and this is going to require the app ID again, right? So remember the app ID, you need to paste that in there. And now the values here, and the values, they are required if you are queuing in an Alteryx Analytic app. Okay, so remember you had those questions on the response of the last API call that we performed. You need to build a JSON here with the answer to those questions. So there was one question called your name, and then you insert the name here, Fernando in this case here. And then there was another question asking for the customer, and then the value here for that question on this case is customer A, right? So you need to build the JSON that will send the information with the answers to every one of those questions for that particular analytic app that you are trying to queue. Okay, so now click on the try it out button after inserting all the necessary information. Then you're gonna see this response here. The ID, the create date, the status queued, so the job has been queued, right? And some other information there like priority, worker tag, and so on and so forth. One thing that is really important here is the ID, right? So that's the ID of the job that you just queued. What can you do now having that ID? You can run another API call to retrieve the state of that job. So you can see if that job is queued, it's running, or it's finished. So I'm going back again, right? Going back to the documentation here, the Swagger, just click on the other endpoint that you want to run. Then on this page here, you're going to insert that job ID that I just copied from the last page, right? So here. And click on the try it out button. The response now of this API call will be the the current state of that particular job ID. And you can see here on this case that it has been completed, right? So status completed, the position success. So it completed successfully with no errors. And you can also see here another ID, outputs and then ID. That ID for the output, it's the ID of the file that has been generated from that workflow. So that workflow, it is generating a file, and that's the ID of that file. And those are the formats that you can download that file. So you can download that as a CSV, for example, right? So you see CSV on that list. And this is the name of the file within the workflow, right? So example YXDB. So whenever you have a YXDB file within the workflow being generated, you can download that on all those formats, okay? How can we do that? How can we download that using the API call? Again, go back to the documentation here. Select the endpoint that will get the output for a given job. This API will require the job ID and the output ID, right? So the job ID and the ID of that particular file, and also the format that you want to download, right? So on this case here, CSV. You can click on the try it out button, and the answer of that API call will now be the content of that file. So you can see that it is a really simple table. This is the header and this is the row, right? So just one row, one header there. So you can see that we went all the way, right? We first got the necessary questions for that particular app. Then we built the API called the queued that particular app for execution with the appropriate answers that we provided for the questions. Then we retrieved the state of a particular job that we created, right? That we queued. We then we queued the job, and then we were able to see that the job has been finished, right? And the job has generated a file, and then we ran another API call to download the output file of that particular workflow. So all the way, right? All right, so I'm just gonna talk a little bit about the authentication methods that are available. So you have the option to use OAuth 1.0 uh, with the endpoints for v1 and v2, although I do not recommend that. Uh, if you have server version 21.3 or older, you only have OAuth 1.0 available. So I recommend everyone updating that to at least 21.4. For the OAuth 1.0, it is what we call one-legged authentication, right? And it requires all those informations there, right? You see the auth consumer key, signature method, right? So you need to send all that information and in order to authenticate using 1.0. But this is not that simple to do, right? With 2.0, the new one, you will only need the base auth endpoint, which is gonna look like this, right? The For the header, you will need the authorization, and that's gonna be a combination of the client ID and secret, base 64 encoded, separated by a column, right? And for the payload, you only need this information here, the grant type, and this value here, client credentials. And that's pretty much it, right? If you perform this operation here, the access token will be provided in the response. And then you can use that access token on all the following requests. The endpoint will be your web API address that you set up in system settings /swagger/UI/index. And this is only for server version 21.4 or later. Okay. For the V3, the new V3 endpoints, Alteryx has created some really cool macros that you can download from the community. So you can see here that we have the get, post, create, delete, and authenticate macro, right? So everything really easy. You just download those macros, install it, and you can use that on your workflow to trigger those API calls and do all those cool stuff there using the V3 endpoints, right? So, and this is an example here of how to use those macros, right? You'll see there, authenticate, and then you're doing some formula here, right? And then I have the create there, is it? Yeah, the create, and then retrieving the data, and then parsing the response from the API call. Okay, so it's pretty simple how to install those and how to use them. The link here, it is pointing to the page on the community that you can download those macros, and you also have the documentation of the of those macros, right? How to use them. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna show you guys here now a few examples of the process that you need to follow in order to perform some operations. The first thing, how to run apps, right? How to run an app using the API call. So you need to get the app ID, the credentials, and the file ID, right? The input files. Then you will need this other endpoint here to get the questions, right? As we did here, I showed you guys how to do that. And then you queue the job. So this will queue the job. You're gonna have the job ID. Then you can see the state of that job, and then you can download the content of that job, right? If you have a file that is being generated. So really, really simple. If you want to migrate a workflow now, what you need to do, you need again the app ID, and you also need the workflow metadata, right? on this other endpoint here. So you need two endpoints to get two sets of information and combine that on another API call that will download the package of that workflow. Okay, so you download the package of the workflow using the API, and then you upload that package using the API on the new server environment. And then you just need to perform another put here to migrate that. Okay, so this is the production process if you want to migrate a particular workflow. Okay, so this is the again workflow migration, but now if you have data connections within the workflow that you don't have on the other server environment, you need to add a process here in the middle, right? That will retrieve the data connections that you have on that workflow, and it is gonna create those connections, right? So you need to get everything that you have here around data connections and make sure that that is present on the second environment as well. This is an example using the view 1 endpoints and OAuth 1.0. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You can see here a pretty simple workflow, right? And we are using some macros to do the authentication. That macro there, you can download that from the community as well to do the 1.0 authentication. And that will require, again, here the key and secret, right? Then you perform all the parsing of the response in order to get the necessary information, right? Like the IDs. You create the new endpoint. So using those IDs, now you're going to create a new endpoint that will download those files. And then you, again, need to authenticate again, right? Because this is OAuth 1.0. And then you perform the following API call to download the workflows. And then the response of this API call will be the workflow file itself within this table here, right? So you can see that this record and this, it is saying bytes there because you have a file within that record. And then you can just save that into an actual file in Windows using the blob output tool. Okay. All right, so just some tips here before we finish. We are all almost at the end here. So you can see some C# and JavaScript fully functional samples available on the community. The macros for Auth 1.0 and 2.0 requests, they are available on the community. The workflow migration between environments is also available on the community, right? So a fully functional workflow that will migrate workflows in between environments. You have examples on the community as well. And there are some Python libraries that are available on GitHub that you can leverage to perform the auth authentication and the Alteryx API calls if you want to do that using Python. Okay. All right. So this is going to be it for this session. The next session, we're going to cover, again, API calls, but we're going to perform some API calls here. And it's going to be live, right? How to build an API call in Alteryx and how to trigger them in Alteryx. Okay. Let me take a look here at the chat and Q&A, see if there is any questions. Okay, so there is one here on in Q&A. It's saying that I'm receiving error transferring data SSL connect error. Um, Errors regarding SSL, they are probably related to how you set up the gallery and if you're using SSL or not on the gallery. So you're gonna have to contact the server administrator to see if you have SSL enabled and if that SSL certificate is valid, and if the server machine is allowing you to perform calls, right, and communicate with external machines using those specific endpoints. Can you elaborate using Alteryx engine as backend for website? Yeah, so what I mean by that is you can have a web page that will show information from a Alteryx workflow. So the web page can run a API call. It can be a button or something on the page, right? That will trigger a workflow, and then the result of that workflow will be presented on that web page. So that's what I mean by using the Alteryx as in a backend for the website. Not actually hosting the website or nothing, right? But using Alteryx to uh, generate content for that page. All right. Let's see if anyone else types anything here. Another question here, can I use Postman? Yes, of course you can. So you can definitely use Postman. Postman is a great tool to leverage API calls, and it's really nice to use. So yes, you can use Postman to trigger all the Alteryx server API calls. All right, I don't see any further questions here. If you do have any further questions later on, feel free to contact us, right? We are more than happy to help you guys on your work. Uh, if no one else has anything else, that's gonna be it here for today. Just gonna present here our offerings related to Alteryx Server. So we do all that enablement and training part, right? So beginning on the assessment and planning, we also do that. We then provide server installation, server migration updates, server health check, all through managed services. All right. So thank you again for attending. Thank you for your participation. I hope you guys enjoyed this session, and I see you all on the next one. Thank you.